In the desert's cradle, beneath a waning moon, the last drumbeats of a kingdom echoed like distant thunder swallowed by time. Shadows leaned long across the sand, cast by colonnades now shattered and toothless, like the ribs of some fallen beast. This was Ebla, once a jewel of kings, now a graveyard of stone and wind. The temple fires had long gone cold, their altars choked in ash and bird bones. The scent of burnt cedar still lingered, mixed with copper dust, like the breath of a dying forge. Statues leaned, broken at the neck. Columns groaned in the night wind. Somewhere, far beyond the gates, a jackal cried, a lonely hymn to a vanished god. Beneath the crumbling palace, beneath frescoes cracked like old skin, a rusted dagger rested in stillness. Its blade pointed to a fresco of a king, with a face half-erased by soot. No tongue remains to name him now. His crown, his wars, his sons, all devoured by the centuries. Yet below, in the belly of the archive, a single lamp flickered. There, surrounded by walls packed tight with scrolls and tablets, sat a scribe whose name history never asked to remember. His hand trembled as he dipped the stylus in ink, the ink made of soot and wine and bitter resin. On clay and papyrus, he wrote not to be remembered, but to remember. He wrote in the voice of a vanishing people, treaties with kingdoms already fallen, prayers to gods already deaf, inventories of grain no one would eat, records of births in houses already burning. Outside the door, the drums of war rose, chariots clawing at the gates like iron wolves. He heard the cries. He smelled the smoke. Still, his hand did not stop. This was his sword, and he wielded it not in hope, but in defiance. He knew what was coming. He knew the torches would breach the gates, that the archives would be overrun, that no army stood between his ink and their fire. But he had sealed the stone door from within, not as a coward, nor as a martyr, but as a witness. The ink flowed like blood. Line after line, he poured memory into clay, knowing that soon there would be no voices left to speak it. His world narrowed to the scratching of reed on parchment, the soft rustle of scrolls being laid to rest like children. Outside, flames painted the sky orange. Inside, the words fell like snow, and then silence. Not a silence of peace, but of extinguishment. When the dust finally settled, Ebla had vanished not with thunder, but with absence, not raised but buried, beneath centuries of dust, storms, and forgetfulness. The palace collapsed in on itself, and the archives were entombed like a body no one came to mourn. The world moved on. Empires rose and fell, none remembering the city carved into desert stone. No kings spoke of her. No priests offered prayers for her ruins. She was a silence beneath the feet of men who thought themselves eternal. But the earth remembers what the tongue forgets. Millennia passed, and then a hand brushed away the soil. A bay trowel kissed stone. A shaft of light pierced the dark. Archaeologists, half-mad with sun and dust, unearthed the bones of a forgotten queen, then a tablet, then another, dozens, hundreds, caked in mud, etched with symbols no living scholar could read. And slowly, so slowly, the voices returned. The tablets spoke of gods no longer worshipped, of laws older than Moses, of treaties with kings whose lands are now pasture, and in their silence, they whispered a truth the modern world is too proud to hear. Civilizations do not end. They are forgotten. One by one, the names came back to life, not through bloodlines or monuments, but through the fragile power of ink and clay. The names of mothers, of warriors, of children never old enough to marry, names that lived only in the margins of a scroll no one read for 4,000 years, names that outlived their conquerors. There were no monuments to these scribes, no statues carved, no songs sung, yet they carried their city on their backs, not in war, but in words. Their courage was quieter than steel, but deeper. Their resistance was not to fight the flames, but to record their heat. And in the end, it worked. Today, we speak of Ebla not because it survived, but because it was written. Because one man, beneath a dying fresco, chose to ink his world into stone even as it burned around him. He could have run, he could have begged, he could have screamed. Instead, he wrote, and in doing so, he made a vow, not to his gods or his king, but to time itself. You may bury us, but you will not erase us. Above ground, the desert remains. The wind still combs through ruined walls like fingers through thinning hair. Jackals still cry in the distance. But now, beneath the museum lights, the tablets lie. Not sacred, not grand, but real. Their words are awkward, their grammar strange, but their voice, alive. And so Ebla lives again, not as empire, but as echo, not as power, but as memory. The flames could not erase the ink, and the silence could not bury the truth. By the edge of a glacial valley, where twilight stretches like a blade and the wind hisses secrets through bent grass, a circle of stone still stands, not as ruin, but as memory. The moor breathes cold mist, and the stones wear the years like cloaks of moss. This is Skara Brae, or what remains of it. Not a city, not even a village by the world's later standards, but once, a cradle. The sea was always near, close enough that the breath of salt clung to every cradle and cloak. The people here carve their lives into the bones of the earth, not for glory, not for conquest, but to endure, to be warm, to be fed, to survive another winter while the wind howled like wolves and the sky cracked with frozen light. Here, in sunken rooms stitched with stone slabs and driftwood beams, life pulsed gently. A seal oil lamp flickered low, casting a golden sheen across the curved bones of a whale, lashed into a shelf. A woman stirred barley in a blackened pot. Her fingers were cracked, but her hands steady, the rhythm of generations guiding her movements. Beside her, a child traced a spiral into sandstone, not knowing why, only that it felt right. The shape echoed something ancient in the blood. Outside, the sea clawed endlessly at the shore, but inside, breath steamed in warm puffs. Words were shared in murmurs, not written. Knowledge passed in calloused hands and fire-warmed stories. There was no alphabet, no chronicle, but they knew the moon's pull. They knew when to net the fish, when to call the seals, when the sun would vanish and when it would return. Their gods wore no crowns. They were tides and winds, shadows and stones. They didn't kneel before them. They lived among them. And in this rhythm, in this hush of survival, they thrived. Until the rhythm changed. It began subtly. The tides grew bold, inching closer with each season. The waves bit deeper into the earth. First, the shells that marked the dead were swept away, tiny bones of babies, scattered like forgotten prayers. Then the graves themselves. The burial mounds, once sacred, crumbled under storm. Memory was the first to drown. Still, they remained, holding to each other, bolstering walls with driftwood, drawing the hearths deeper into the belly of the earth. But the sea would not be reasoned with. One storm, then another. Roofs ripped like paper, doors splintered. The fish stopped coming. The seals moved on. One by one, homes were abandoned. Some fled inland, though nothing grew in that stone-clad hinterland. Others vanished without trace, swallowed by wind, by wave, by silence. And in the end, when the last lamp flickered out, it did so not in panic, but in resignation. A soft goodbye whispered into darkness. No scribe recorded their end. No bard sang their sorrow. There are no scrolls, no sagas, no names, but there are midden heaps. There are charred bones. There are walls shaped by bare hands, still snug after 5,000 years, built not with mortar, but with memory. And there is silence, a profound, echoing silence, heavier than words. It is not absence, it is presence, it is reverence, because Skara Brae was never meant to be eternal. It was meant to be enough, and yet it endures, not in power, but in persistence, not in conquest, but in continuity. The wind still touches the stones, the sea still sings its old refrain, and the spirals, those strange spirals, carved by a child long gone, still remain. What did they mean? A sun, a path, a story with no ending? Or were they simply an instinct, a mark to say, I was here, I saw the sea, I heard the wind, I lived? Even now, when the mist curls over the valley like breath over a dying flame, you can feel them. The mother boiling barley, the child drawing spirals, the seal oil flickering. They are not ghosts, they are echoes, and the stones, they remember, because even lives without empires matter, because every forgotten breath once warmed the world, and though no one came to record their last dawn, the dawn still came. It always does. But what lies beyond the light, when memory fades and silence settles, is where the next story begins. When empires finally do rise, and with them, kings who believe they can hold back the tide. Not like the rustle of leaves in a spring grove, but as a beast, deep, wet, eternal, a green furnace of decay and memory. Here, vines coil like serpents through cracked ziggurats. Roots claw apart obsidian causeways once polished by 1,000 royal footsteps. And in that suffocating cradle of emerald, swallowed whole by centuries, lies El Mirador, the great heart of the Maya, a city that rose before calendars, before prophecy, before even memory dared to stretch that far. At first light, when the red macaws screamed their ancient warnings into the damp air, the pyramids still glistened, black with moss yet proud. Their steps were sharp, their tops still kissed by mist and fire. Priests in robes heavy with jade and quetzal feathers emerged like spirits from shadowed chambers, whispering to the gods with incense and blood. Below them, the slaves were already at work, bare feet blistered against sun-baked stone, shoulders streaked with lime and sweat. They moved like ants, nameless, faceless, their pain the mortar that bound heaven to earth. Every brick they placed was not just stone, but scripture. Every wall, a hymn. They did not speak of freedom. They only whispered prayers to not be the next one chosen, because the gods demanded much. Sacrifice here was not symbolic. It was sacred, and blood, still warm, was the language of the divine. Beneath temple altars, bones filled the silence between chants. Some gave willingly, most did not, and all of them were told. This was how the world stayed spinning. The stars, the rain, the harvest, all hung in the balance. And so they gave. Everything. And for a time, it worked. El Mirador became legend while still alive. A metropolis of hundreds of thousands in a sea of green, its avenues wide as ambition, its temples taller than the treetops. The kings spoke through stelae, carved from mountains, and set upright like thunderclaps. They told of lineage and lightning, of wars won and enemies devoured. They told of gods who walked among men. But even greatness has a pulse. And when that pulse weakens, it is not a scream. It is a whisper. The trade routes, once thick with salt, obsidian, and cacao, began to dry like the jungle's own veins. Drought came, not as a single disaster, but as a slow, cracking breath. Crops failed. Wells turned to dust. The sacred cenotes, those jeweled eyes of the gods, sank into silence. The priests cast their beans. They burned more copal. They whispered more urgently. But the gods were already walking away. It started with the outer villages. Families vanished into the trees. Then the builders stopped building. The quarries fell silent. The altars, so often wet with blood, grew dry. And still, the kings sat high. Still, they demanded loyalty. Still, they prayed louder. Still, they declared the gods were listening, but the people were not. They left. One by one, barefoot and bitter, they walked into the green. Some were swallowed whole. Others found new homes along the rivers. They left behind their scrolls, their jade, their calendars, and most of all, their faith. Because how could the gods live in temples that echoed like tombs, and the silence came, not as peace, but as rot? The jungle wasted no time. It surged forward like a lover reunited. Trees cracked palace walls. Orchids bloomed from gutters once lined with gold. Frogs sang where priests once chanted. And the ceiba trees, those ancient, sky-bridging giants, grew tall above it all, their roots wrapped around forgotten thrones. Time, too, moved on. It carried kings into myth. It turned temples into hills. And for over 1,000 years, El Mirador ceased to exist, until the sky remembered. From the cockpit of a scouting aircraft, a shadow moved beneath the trees. Not a single temple, but dozens. Not a village, but a city. A capital. A civilization. Its edges too massive to understand. Its roads too straight for nature's hand. And suddenly the jungle trembled again, not from conquest or prayer, but from rediscovery. El Mirador was not gone. It had merely waited. The archaeologists came next, machetes in hand, brushes, drones, questions. They peeled back the leaves with reverence and awe, and they found what should not exist. Walls 5 stories tall, reservoirs engineered with genius, canals wide as rivers, dug with only stone and sweat, and bones, so many bones, skulls stacked in ceremonial pits, children curled beside statues, warriors still gripping stone blades in frozen defiance, all of them whispering truths no textbook had dared to write. This was not a utopia, nor was it a nightmare. It was something far more human, a city that reached too high, asked too much, and collapsed under the weight of its own divinity. And now, in the heat and hush of noon, when the birds grow silent and the moss sighs with memory, you can still hear them. Not words, not voices, but the ache of a people who once believed they could hold the sky. The ceiba trees hold it now. They rise where kings once sat, their limbs like prayers, their trunks like altars, and maybe, just maybe, they remember it all. Every scream, every sacrifice, every sunrise. They remember the moment power slipped into silence, and they wait, still, for what comes next. Because this was not the only city swallowed by the forest. Beyond El Mirador, deeper still into the jungle's breath, lies another ruin, one where gods demanded even more, where obsidian was sharper and the hunger deeper, where kings did not just claim divinity, they became it, and where the end was not silence, but fire. Fade into shadows. The camera moves through twisted vines as thunder rolls in the distance. A new temple looms ahead, half drowned in roots. The story is not over. A hush falls across the grassland. No birds, no wind, just the trembling hush before a storm. Then, a torch flickers in the distance, then another, and another, until the horizon glows with fire, like the teeth of some burning god, funeral pyres, rising like ghost tongues into the night. Ash falling like snow across the steppe. They came without monuments, these riders. No stone cities, no carved epics. Only hooves, dust, and the breath of a people who lived between sky and earth. They called no man king, no land forever theirs. But when they rode, the ground itself remembered. This was the world of the Yamnaya. Beneath storm-churned clouds, in what we now call Ukraine, they lived and died in the shadow of firelight. Men with braids woven tight with bone and bead, women who sang to the wind, children raised on the rhythm of hoofbeats and hunger. They were not builders, they were not scribes, they were movers of herds, of language, of blood. In their eyes burned something old, not ancient in the way of decay, but old like the sea, unmeasured, unending. Their carts groaned with the weight of ritual, bundles of grain, sacred figures carved from horn, icons of gods whose names we no longer know. They crossed valleys and rivers, never staying long, not out of fear, but because the land itself seemed to demand movement. To stay was to rot, to ride was to live. In death, they left behind only silence and earth. Ochre-lined graves scattered like punctuation across the plains, each one a whisper in the soil. A man laid on his back, arms crossed, a flint blade tucked beneath his ribs, horse bones at his side, as if ready to ride beyond the veil. His mouth does not speak, but the position of his hands, the careful placement of tools, the red ochre staining his skull, they scream belief. And in that silence, something echoes. The Yamnaya had no writing, no scrolls, no ink, yet from their throats came the seeds of language, syllables that would fracture and spread, giving birth to tongues that still move our lips today. Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, Slavic. They did not write words, but they spoke futures. When you whisper mother, when you name the stars, when you curse, pray, sing, you speak fragments of their world. But time is not kind to wanderers. Rain erases, stone crushes. Empires rise not by remembering, but by burying. The tracks of their carts were washed away long before history bothered to look. Their burial mounds, kurgans, were split open, looted, forgotten. Cities rose atop their bones. Walls climbed where once they galloped, and where they whispered to the wind, now only concrete hums. Yet the land remembers. It always does. Sometimes a child finds a comb in the dirt, crafted from antler, still smooth with forgotten fingers. Sometimes a spiral is found etched into shale, a shape repeated across thousands of miles, as if all their miles had a pattern. A copper axe dulled with time, buried deep in a grave that never should have been found. Archaeologists call it data. But it is not data. It is a heartbeat, long stopped, still echoing. For theirs was not a civilization of stone, but of motion, a people of flow. And like rivers, they reshaped everything they touched. They brought the wheel, the horse, the idea that gods rode the sky, not walked the earth. They brought thunder, and they moved like it. Close your eyes. Beneath the weight of centuries, beyond the noise of cities and the blindness of maps, imagine the wind across endless grass. Imagine the stars undimmed, the firelight flickering on bronze skin, the scent of pine sap and sweat and wet leather. A girl sits beside her mother, learning to braid beads into her hair, listening to stories not of kings, but of storms, of wolves that walk upright, of rivers that drink sorrow, of ancestors who ride beside the moon. The past is not past. It is breath. Somewhere out there, the steppe still sings. Somewhere the hooves still drum the earth, and the sky still bends to the fire below. Their gods were not gods of temples. They were gods of thunder, of motion, of change. And perhaps that is why the Yamnaya survive. Not in palaces, not in books, but in our bones. We carry them, in language, in rhythm, in dream. The grass sways, the fire dims, and in the hush that follows, a shape moves at the edge of the wind. A rider without face, without name, carrying something ancient in their chest. We cannot see them, but we feel them. They pass behind the hills and vanish. Only the smoke remains, and far off, a flicker, not of flame, but of torchlight on stone. The next world awaits. A world where the wheel becomes empire, and the whisper of the steppe becomes the war cry of kings. But before that cry, there was only silence, and the firelight of the forgotten. The air is thick, not with war cries or the clash of steel, but with the warmth of goat-fat smoke drifting into a sun-bleached sky. Beneath the salt-white cliffs of the Anatolian coast, there is no roar of conquest, no echo of kings, only the hush of a city without streets, a city that breathes through rooftops. Çatalhöyük, a name now whispered through wind and ruin, but once it pulsed with life. Thousands of souls pressed close in a hive of clay and silence. Each home a cell, each rooftop a road. Children skipped from ceiling to ceiling, women sang as they ground barley to dust, and men traded obsidian blades under the watchful gaze of painted bulls. There were no palaces, no thrones, no walls of separation, just warmth, just closeness, just ritual. The homes, womb-like, windowless, glowed with ochre reds and soot-blacked beams. Walls were thick with the scent of generations. Dried figs hung in bundles, hides stretched taut over wooden racks, and the musky aroma of goat clung to the air like memory. From every ceiling, smoke curled upward, an offering to the sky, a tether between earth and what lay beyond. They did not bury their dead outside the city. They cradled them beneath the floorboards. Infants swaddled in reed baskets, elders curled like sleeping dogs, laid beneath the very beds their kin would dream upon. The dead did not leave. They remained, a root system beneath the soil of daily life. Their art told stories not of war, but of wombs. The divine was heavy-breasted, wide-thighed, life-giver, earth-mother. Her painted form bloomed from the walls like spring from thawed stone. No swords were etched into these walls, no horsemen galloped across plaster. Instead, leopards, vultures, the cycle of harvest and decay. But something shifted. No scream split the night. No invading force raised their rooftops. No pyres lit the sky in warning. It was quieter than that. First, a stillness. A pause in the music of routine, a bread oven left cold, a painted bull fading beneath layers of soot, the scent of fig gone sour. Then, one by one, homes fell silent, not violently, not even suddenly, just like breath held too long. Families gathered their bundles. They walked away without a trail. No scribbled warnings, no shattered idols, just absence. And still, the rooftops remained, empty, waiting. Archaeologists would come millennia later with their brushes and charts. They would crawl through collapsed ceilings and trace the ghosts of footprints in ash. They would argue, drought, disease, soil depletion, faith abandoned, but they would never find blood. Because Çatalhöyük did not fall. It unraveled. It forgot itself. Its art stopped speaking. Its goddess lost her eyes to wind and time. Plaster peeled like old bark. And the silence that replaced it was not peaceful. It was haunted. For this city had known a different kind of power, not the kind that conquers, but the kind that binds. A communal heartbeat. A rhythm, older than nations. When that heartbeat faltered, the body dispersed. Perhaps a drought shriveled their crops. Perhaps the dead beneath their beds began to whisper wrong. Perhaps the sky, once so near, began to feel too far. Or maybe they simply outgrew their cradle. Not every leaving is a breaking. Sometimes it is a drifting, like pollen on wind, like breath after song. Still, something mourns in those ruins. The goddess remains, smeared and eyeless, watching walls collapse inward. Watching the bones beneath the floors lose their names, watching time steal memory until even forgetting is forgotten. And yet she endures. The heavy hips, the curved thighs, the eternal promise of return. Because even in ruin, Çatalhöyük tells a story that knives and kings cannot. A story of community, of breath shared and death embraced. Of a people who worshipped not by killing, but by remembering. By sleeping over their ancestors, by walking across each other's homes. There are no heroes here, no villains, only the quiet grace of survival. And then, the fading echo of something lost. Now, beneath the sun-scorched crust of Anatolia, the city dreams in fragments. Ash, Charcoal, a child's painted handprint, a broken obsidian blade, a necklace made from the teeth of a fox, all buried, all waiting. Some say history begins with empires, with steel, with records scratched into stone. But before the sword, there was the hearth. Before kings, there were mothers, painting goddesses with swollen bellies onto red clay walls, whispering prayers not for victory, but for rain, for fig trees, for life. We walk now through the dust of what once was, a city without streets, without monuments, without war. And yet, more human than many that followed. For here they lived with the dead, honored the feminine, and moved not by command, but by rhythm. Then, like a sigh too long held, they were gone. Gone, but not erased. The rooftops may be broken, but their story presses through the silence. In the shadows of Anatolia, the wind still remembers the scent of goat fat and dried figs. The earth still remembers the warmth of bodies sleeping above bones. And in some quiet hour of dusk, if you listen closely, you may still hear the hum of a city without streets, breathing through time. But this was only the beginning, because after Çatalhöyük vanished, others would rise, some with iron in their hands, some with gods carved in fire. The world would harden, power would fracture, walls would rise, not of clay, but of stone, and from this vanishing would bloom another chapter, where death was not buried softly, but delivered by blade and crown. We leave behind the hush of Çatalhöyük, and step into the noise of empires. Not a howl, but a hush, like a prayer exhaled through cracked lips. Where once the great salt lake of Lop Nur shimmered in defiance of the desert, there is only dust now. Pale, wind-scoured dust, that knows the names of the dead, but will not speak them. Lulan. The name is almost a sound the wind makes when it slips between the ribs of a buried wall. Once, this was a haven, a city stitched into the very skin of the Silk Road, nestled like a jewel between empires. Here, caravans gathered like drifting constellations, weaving gold from the west with lacquer from the east. Camels groaned under the weight of embroidered saddlebags. The scent of saffron clung to the hands of merchants, and the tinkle of wind bells marked the rhythm of trade. Reeds trembled gently along the banks of an ancient canal, now a vein run dry. And in a house of clay and sun-baked stone, a girl sat cross-legged by the firelight. Her name is lost, though her braid remains. She stitched cranes into silk with fingers that did not yet know war or drought or abandonment. Her eyes, dark and still, dreamed of Samarkand's domes and Chang'an's bustling roads, places she would never see, yet touched every day in the goods that passed her doorway. The world moved through Lulan, and she felt perhaps like the center of something vast and alive. But even the most graceful thread frays with time. The river, that lifeline of glimmering promise, changed its course. No war, no fire, no king's decree, only the quiet betrayal of nature. The water withdrew with the silence of a lover leaving in the night. Wells dried like tears too long withheld. Streets disappeared beneath creeping dunes, grain by grain. The laughter of markets faded, roofs cracked, cloth stiffened. Life, without water, became a slow kind of dying. And somewhere in the hush between days, the girl died too. She was found centuries later, her braid still neatly tied, her face turned slightly as though listening for footsteps that never came. Her body, mummified by the desert's merciless grace, bore no signs of struggle, just stillness. As if she had fallen asleep before the silence could reach her. Her hands, small, delicate, still curled around the hem of a half-finished crane. Lulan did not vanish in fire or fury. It faded, slowly, softly, like breath on glass. No single scream marked its end, only the long, unraveling quiet of a city waiting for a rain that never came. And yet, beneath the dunes, something lingers, a pulse, a memory, a kind of heartbeat, not of the living, but of the once alive, the kind that clings to the corners of old stones and whispers through broken archways. Here lies a scroll, its ink faded into silence. There, a child's shoe, too small for any grown foot, its strap still knotted. These are not relics of kings or warriors, but of the ordinary, the forgotten breath of humanity, a spoon, a comb, a doll's painted eye, the kind of things that prove they lived. And in that proof, we find not just decay, but longing. The kind of longing that outlives the body, that seeps into sand, that turns ruins into echoes. Lulan was not a city of palaces. It was a city of people, of tea poured at dusk, of whispered blessings before sleep, of silk smoothed gently before sale. It was a place where faith mingled with commerce, where 1,000 tongues spoke across the same fire, where a girl could dream of distant cities even as her own quietly unraveled. How many lives vanished without notice here? How many prayers went unanswered as the lake withdrew, step by step, like a lover losing interest? The sands swallowed homes, then names, then stories, but not completely, not forever. Because every time the wind shifts, Lulan breathes again, not in voice, but in trace. In the fragments archaeologists lift like petals from a grave, a lacquered box, a rusted pin, a letter never sent. The desert is cruel, yes, but also a keeper. What it kills, it also preserves. And so Lulan endures, not in glory, but in memory. And in memory, it becomes more than a ruin. It becomes a mirror. For what is a civilization, if not fragile? What is prosperity, if not temporary? One shift of river, one tilt of fortune, and everything changes. The girl with the silk needle could be any of us, stitching our hopes into cloth while the tide pulls silently away. Lulan is not gone. It speaks through silence now. And if you listen closely, in the hush after dusk, you might hear her, that nameless girl, still threading cranes, still dreaming of Samarkand, still waiting for the world to return to her door. But it won't. The Silk Road moved on, caravans rerouted, empires rose and fell beyond her reach. Lulan became dust, and the girl became myth. But even myths have roots, deep and tangled, and under the dunes, her heartbeat lingers, software persistent, refusing to vanish. Beyond the crumbled threshold of her home, night settles like a veil. The wind passes through once more, catching on a half-buried post, whistling a note both sweet and mournful, as if even the desert remembers. And far in the distance, past where the lake once shimmered, past the bones of the last caravan trail, a faint light stirs in the dark. The next story begins, where the wind carries not silence, but the cry of steel. The mist rose thick that morning, not drifting, but clinging, like the breath of ghosts curling around the gnarled roots of ancient oaks. The forest of Bohemia groaned in silence, broken only by the slow beat of distant hooves. It was not yet dawn, and yet something old in the earth stirred, a silence too sharp to be natural, as if even the birds dared not break it. Above the treetops, ravens wheeled, black scythes slicing through the gray, shrieking warnings no one would heed. Beneath that canopy, wrapped in cold fog and prophecy, stood Libyacy, a fortress not of stone, but timber and faith. Walls of oak beams thick as oxen, sharpened stakes blackened with pitch, and a watchtower that peered out over fields sown with barley and hope. Within its embrace lived the Slavniks, noble, pious, proud. Their banners bore golden lions dancing on crimson fields. Their chapel bells, cast by monks with burnt palms, rang each dawn with Latin hymns that pierced the woods like spears of sound. They were a house of peace, but not weakness. Their swords were forged in Prague, their alliances inked in blood and parchment. Yet behind closed chapel doors, as wax pooled beneath flickering candles, the elder brother, Sobieslav, sometimes glanced too long at maps, and muttered prayers that tasted more like fear. Because peace in these lands was a brittle reed, and it had begun to crack. The river that curled near Libicet had once carried trade, salt, mead, copper. But now it whispered with other things, rumors, resentment, the slow drumbeat of vengeance. Farther west, in Prague, rose the Przemyslid house, powerful, devout in another way, sharp with Latin, but sharper with ambition. And in their courts, voices began to speak the Slavnik name with bitterness. Not rivals, they insisted, heretics, traitors, a splinter in the holy order. Some believed it was jealousy, of coin, of alliances, of kin who whispered with both Saxons and Poles. Others believed it was holy fire, that God had chosen one path, and those who knelt on another must burn. Whatever truth sat beneath those whispers, it was on the morning of September 28, 995, that the verdict came. It began with smoke. A single curl, snaking above the eastern gate like a question. Then more, rising in plumes, black and thick, until the village square stank of burning pitch and pine. By the time the bell rang, it was already too late. They came with no warning, no parley, no heraldry, only steel. The gates of Libicet groaned and splintered like bones under boot. Men screamed, dogs howled, children were dragged from beds, their cries vanishing beneath the clamor of hooves and iron. In the chapel, Father Vitor tried to hold the door, his knuckles white on a crucifix, voice cracking on the words of Psalm 91. He will shelter you with his wings. But the hinges burst with a scream of iron, and they trampled him underfoot, his blood mixing with spilled sacramental wine. Mothers threw themselves across their children. Sons reached for swords too heavy for their hands, and the soldiers, hard-eyed men from Prague, armor smeared with soot and wax, moved through the holy place like butchers. Some say Boleslaus II, Duke of Bohemia, gave the order himself. Others say it came from bishops, cloaked in velvet and vengeance. What matters is this: no one was spared. In the hall of the Slavniks, Prince Sobislav stood his ground. His sword sang as it struck, once, twice, but he was one man, and they were legion. The last words he uttered were not in Latin, but in the old Slavic tongue, whispered to the wind, "Do not forget us." By noon the fires had died, and Libicet was still. Where once hymns had echoed, now there was only the crackle of embers and the buzz of carrion flies. Stone was scorched, tapestries torn. The altar lay broken, the statue of Mary cleaved down the middle, her face shattered into dust. The massacre was swift, deliberate, a cleansing not of sin, but of memory. The Slavnik line, proud defenders of Bohemia's eastern heart, ended not with a battlefield cry, but with silence. A silence so deep that even the monks who survived were forbidden to write it down. Scrolls burned, seals broken, names erased, but time is stubborn, and stone remembers. In the centuries that followed, grass grew over Libicet. The wooden walls rotted, their beams devoured by worms and time. Trees took root where warriors once stood, and the winds returned, gentler now, carrying only whispers. Yet one thing remained: the chapel threshold, carved from stone, worn smooth by centuries of barefoot prayers, rain, and the mossy grief of forgotten generations. A simple slab, half buried now, beside the modern village church that stands nearby. They say if you kneel there, just before sunrise, and press your hand to the stone, it's warm. As if something beneath still breathes. As if the earth remembers what men tried to erase. And so, Libicet lingers. Not in glory nor ruin, but in absence. A void in the story of Bohemia, where a noble house vanished like breath on frost. Their memory now a hush in the trees, a tremble in old hymns, a name chiseled faintly in stone. But something else was born in the ashes that day, a legacy of consolidation, of power made absolute. The Psemislids, unopposed now, began weaving their crown tighter around the throat of Bohemia. Faith became rule, steel became scripture, and the dream of one land, one language, one power burned into being on that blood-soaked morning. Still, the land does not forget. And sometimes when the mists return, curling low and cold across the old woods of Libyshe, the ravens still circle, black and watchful, waiting. For what? None can say. And elsewhere, beyond the rivers, beyond the forests, a boy was being taught not just to pray but to rule. For in the hollow left by the Slavniks, new voices rose. And one name, still a child, would carry the weight of a kingdom not yet born, one who would rise from this silence to reshape Bohemia itself.